Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Today is July 12th, Monday, 2021. So I'm really happy to be back on track with our Q&As and to have a chance because we have several questions that have come in over the last couple of weeks that I'm excited to get to. So if you have questions you'd like to submit, you can submit them at any time via the email webinar@evoketherapy.com. You can also submit them throughout the broadcast this evening. Malia, who's moderating for me this evening, will pass those on to me when time permits during the broadcast. Sounds like we have several pre-submitted questions, so I'm going to get to those as quickly as I can. Whatever's left over, we'll push back to the next broadcast. So with that, let me get into the first question. The first question reads, typically, what percentage of kids go to a therapeutic boarding school or to residential treatment center after a wilderness therapy experience? We expect our son to be at the wilderness therapy program for about 8 weeks or so. I'll say a couple of things about this question. It's a very common, understandable question because people kind of want to know that. First of all, the percentages are about 2/3 that go on to some kind of residential setting, therapeutic boarding school, residential treatment center, clinical program. So about 2/3. In the summertime, it's a little bit higher because people are perhaps waiting for summer in less severe circumstances. That's not always true, of course, but it goes down a little bit in the summertime and then it goes up in the wintertime or during the school year, I should say. So, but overall throughout the year, it averages around 2/3. I'll simply say this to you. Theoretically, when I started wilderness therapy and when we started our program, even we had a bias. I had a bias toward coming home after wilderness therapy. It's only through experience that we've kind of moved the needle on that bias toward a residential setting. It's simply that watching clients and students go through the process, families go through the process and getting to the point where they're ready for the next step. It's appealing. The client has often, in many cases, done very well in the program. But our experience is that families tend to be happier, that when they get to this point, even though that coming home idea is appealing, especially for the child, that people tend to enjoy the success that comes with longer term treatment. And it's hard. It's hard to kind of, once you've kind of let the toothpaste out of the tube, to put it back in. I was always going to say that in an ideal world, if I could choose what time clients come to the program, it would be somewhere in the first part of their shortly after their 17th birthday, because you would have time to go to wilderness, you would have time to go to some kind of transitional program, program, step down program, therapeutic program, and then you would kind of launch them into young adulthood. Now, of course, our children don't cooperate with that model. They require treatment far earlier or maybe even later than 17, but it would, think about it as the second step is more like life, kind of practicing with something that's more mainstream and less contained than wilderness therapy, but not too large of a step where they're going from a really therapeutically structured and supported program like Evoke to home, which can be a big drop off in terms of the amount of support that could be beneficial or required for the child. So that's about as long of an answer I can give to that. 2/3 is the simple answer. Somebody asks, how would you describe the difference in your two books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You? Great question. I think The Journey of the Heroic Parent is more well written, to be frank with you, and that's because it took a longer time to write and to edit. So it's a tighter, more tightly written book. I like The Audacity to Be You because it's an evolution of my work. And one of the things I didn't like about The Journey of the Heroic Parent is that the title tended to exclude people that aren't in looking for self-help because they're parenting a child that's struggling. I wanted to say this isn't just for parents. You know, that I want people to read The Journey of the Heroic Parent as a child, kind of to understand what they missed in their childhood. Um, I think The Journey of the Heroic Parent is less philosophical, more practical than The Audacity to Be You. I would say The Journey of the Heroic Parent came out of these webinars and working as a wilderness therapist, while The Audacity to Be You came out of our intensive program and my more of my own work, even though there's plenty of that in the first book. So it's I prefer it because it's the more advanced version. I don't think it's as tightly written as the first book, but that's just a critique for myself. So parenting is the first one. More practical is the first one. More kind of structured and systematic in its thinking. And then the Audacity to Be You, I just kind of broke more rules and opened it up more. Critically, the Audacity to Be You receives more positive acclaim from people. But I don't have a preference about which order you read it in. I think that they blend well with each other, but that's kind of my simple answer. I've never been asked that question. Somebody asks, I notice that when we have disagreements or big arguments with my son, it's almost always because I react either right away or not in a proper way after something happens or he does something. How can I remind myself that I'm wearing Luke Skywalker's helmet and to confront the power head on is stupid? I feel an urge to do something. Your question is the answer. Keep talking about. I would even name this with your child if you could. For me, one of my big breakthroughs in therapy came when I won't tell the specific story. I've told it many times, but when I came home from a professional interaction, and I was kicking myself because my stuff, my symptoms, my issues were present in this interaction. And as I was confessing them to my therapist, she said, well, you could be ashamed and hate this thing that you do, or you could explore it and maybe even write about it. And I'm sure a lot of people can relate to it, which I decided to do. I leaned into it and I wrote about it and I put it on my blog. And ever since then, and this is about 7 years ago, when my stuff comes up, when my insecurity comes up, when my feeling of not feeling safe comes up, when I'm trying to impress people, I see my symptoms start to kind of show up. I can pause and slow down. So naming it more and more to more people, write about it, write a blog. And heck, I haven't told you guys this ever, but we're happy to publish blogs from parents. We would love to publish blogs from parents who have gone through this process and got something out of it. So, you know, even journal about your reactiveness, your trigger, your trauma response. Share it with the people close to you. Share it with your therapist. I would say lean into it instead of hating it or being frustrated with it. And I can't tell you what to feel, but that would be the shift I would encourage you to consider, because it's not going to go away immediately. It's like when one of my therapists said to me not too long ago, I don't want to be codependent. And I said to them, you don't get that choice today. You know, today you are. Maybe with a lot of work, you can heal and recover and make progress, but you don't get to not be triggered today by your son. You don't get to not have a knee-jerk reaction to your son. So in the meantime, lean into it. Sometimes students in the field will be very motivated to do their work and will point out some kind of defense, some kind of symptom, some kind of mental health issue. And they'll say, okay, I want to fix that. I'm going to stop that. And I say, slow down just a little bit. There's really important material on all the in-between. I think most people want to get rid of the weed as quickly as possible. And so the instinct is to cut it off at the surface. But Spend some time listening. I shared something on my Instagram today at Dr. Brad Reedy that talked about when self-help writers or teachers tell you to be brave or to be courageous or um, to feel or think a certain way. I'm very wary of that. And rather than being brave or being curious or being something better or telling you to do that, I'd rather ask, why were you scared? Why were you hurt? So my answer is lean into the wound. It's not going to go away, and spend some time gently holding it like you would a little child and saying to your depression, to your anxiety, to your symptom, I'm here for you. What do you need from me? Tell me about it. For me today, when I see that stuff come up, I'm not immune to it. I'm just more likely to hear it, to sit with it, and to feel it and to not act it out impulsively. But it's a gradual, tiny step by tiny step problem that is only improved as one works on letting go of the shame and the guilt and the judgment for oneself and how we struggle. Somebody says, what do you do when your child's assigned therapist is acting in ways that conflict with everything you are watching on the webinars? I actually had this discussion with the person that wrote this question because I didn't know if they were talking about an evoke therapist, and it's really the same kind of work. First of all, that means to me that the webinars are working. I want you to be informed. I want you to know that you are empowered to respond in a different way with your therapist at Evoke and to challenge them. So the first thing at Evoke, and I think it could be this way anywhere, is tell them how you're feeling. And if that doesn't work, then tell them with me on the phone. And if that doesn't work, then we're going to change therapists. And in the long run, we're not going to keep that therapist. Correct? But that's, I was just doing a training. I did a 3-hour training today with our intensive therapists and our therapeutic coaches. And I explained to them, I said, if you get lucky enough, if you get lucky enough for a client to tell you that they don't like what you're doing, that they're annoyed with what you're doing, that's gold. That's the most beautiful moment you can imagine, because you have the opportunity to respond to them in ways that their parents and other authority figures haven't responded to them, which is you get to say things like, I'm so glad you're talking about it, and I'm so sorry. And wow, that took a lot of courage. The quote that I shared with my team was, you're allowed to tell your therapist, no, that's not it. So when I started doing these webinars 14 years ago, part of it was I was moving out of a direct service role as a wilderness therapist, but part of it was I wanted us to be accountable to this stuff. I wanted you to feel empowered to ask our therapists difficult questions and receive smart, intelligent answers. I wanted you to tell us when it's not working for you or when you felt not cared about, not heard. And if the therapist is rigid and defensive of their model and their approach, then they need help. So one thing I didn't say to this person that I'll say to you all right now is the webinars are working if you're using that to measure the evoke therapist, and in my opinion, other therapists against the standard that I'm talking about and teaching about. You have a right to be treated with respect, with dignity. You have a right to be responded to with compassion and non-judgment. And if you start to feel like your therapist is frustrated or upset or annoyed or exhausted by you, that's a therapist problem, not your problem. So I'm glad that you reached out. I'm glad that you asked. And I want you all, not just with your Evoke therapist, but with your therapist at any therapeutic program, anywhere, even an outpatient therapist. In fact, there's one of you right now, and I won't mention you by name because of confidentiality. There's at least one of you. There might be several of you, but you have told me the story where you took this idea You weren't quite sure. This person told me they weren't quite sure if their therapist was the stuff, had the stuff. So they went back and told their therapist, gave their therapist some feedback, and to their joy and relief, the therapist responded wonderfully, compassionately, and capably. And to me, that's what we hope for. Somebody writes, even though my son did not go to Evoke, I am an alumni from a Finding You intensive with Emma and Trevor. I think you mean Travis. Emma and Travis. And have been doing my work over the last year, podcasts, your books, therapy. My son is now 21 and just had a psychotic event, his first, associated with bipolar disorder and heavy marijuana use. Any insight you can provide to parents dealing with a child with psychosis is very much appreciated. You know, your question is humbling because psychosis is so rare. I haven't had to deal with it in my personal life. Most of Evoke population don't suffer from psychosis or psychotic symptoms. So in that way, it's humbling because it's outside of my day-to-day experience. I do have some clients that have dealt with it, and I've had some even wilderness clients that have dealt with it, and had some parents who have had that experience during, before, and some after Evoke therapy programs. What I would say to you is find support. I mean, in a way, the question, the psychosis stuff, doesn't differentiate, and I'll explain that. It doesn't differentiate itself from other cases. It's like you have a child with a physical ailment, right? Imagine if you had a child who suffered from childhood cancer, for example, right? Or some potentially deadly disease, or car accident, or depression that has with it a high level of suicidality, right? All of these kind of overwhelming or severe addiction to opiates, right? Some people have that. It's the same work, which is, you've been given a child who has the cards stacked against them. In a way, you have the cards stacked against you. And so you need support, you need community, you need to not be alone. It goes back to my idea that I talk about sometimes, which is sometimes as therapists and friends and parents, we have to learn to sit with others in their unsolvable problems. And you have what very well could be an unsolvable problem. And so I don't have any tricks or clever ideas about how to fix it or reframe it, except for to say, find community support, find a therapist that can support you. And in a way, it's very unique. Like I started off when I answered this question when I was beginning, but in a way, it's no different than anything else, which is you can't change or fix somebody else. And so what you're left with is how to cope with grief and loss and sadness and powerlessness and an inability to help somebody that you love as much as you're capable of loving somebody. So I'm glad that you're here. If you're here, I'm glad that you asked. I'm sorry that you're suffering that way. I'm humbled by the question because it's outside of the scope of what I typically deal with on a day-to-day basis. And find people that are dealing with loved ones who have seemingly untreatable or unfixable issues, and get the support and community there so that you don't have to be alone in it. So thank you. Somebody writes, what way can we grandparents help in recovery besides offering unconditional love? Can or should we try to communicate with our grandson while he's in your program? I love this question. Love this question. More than what you say to them, ask questions. Be curious. Especially because you're a grandparent, which tells me that you're of a certain age, at least. It's best that you not have answers or not have wisdom or lectures to give to your grandchild. The ideal, in my mind, would be to make yourself familiar with some of the teachings of the program, with some of the our materials, our resources, the books or assignments or webinars or podcasts that we recommend. Reading one of my books, right? Reading a book that the child, your grandchild, has been assigned. But all of that is to begin to say to the child, I'm learning stuff too. Or, wow, there's something that I learned in kind of familiarizing myself with what you're going through that I never found out. If you can be with them as a student, learn alongside of them, just think how great that will make them feel. Just think. If you can be vulnerable and admit your fallibility and your mistakes and your not knowing, how powerful will that be for the grandchild? So unconditional love, sure, as much as you can. Acquaint yourself with the psychology of the program. And if you're able to, share with them at an equal level kind of what you're learning. I mean, theoretically, you're the one who raised their parents who raised them. So the legacy of family trauma has been passed down through you, from your parents to you, to your children, to them. And so you're part of the issue. And if you can identify, I remember my best conversation I ever had with my grandfather. He was taking me to the dentist because my mother wasn't available. My grandfather was a very stoic man. He was kind most of the time, but he was a functional alcoholic, had a very successful career in business. And I remember one time he had the gall, or the courage, I should say, that's a better word, to ask me while we were heading to the dentist why I did drugs. I was 16 at the time. And my grandpa and I, we didn't talk about that stuff. And I did my best to answer the question. And I said, I think I do drugs for the same reason that you drink, because it makes me feel better. And he wasn't defensive about it. And he took it to heart. And of all the conversations I ever had with my grandfather, by far, and it's not even close, that was the most meaningful, healing discussion, when I was able to make a connection between my symptoms and his symptoms. And granted, his symptoms didn't cause the kind of dysfunction and problems that mine did, for sure. But that's not the point. They served the same purpose, which was to make him feel better, to make me feel better. Somebody writes, my 15-year-old son is at Evoke in Utah. A psych evaluation by Dr. O diagnosed my son with autism. This is the first ever autism diagnosis. Years ago, he was assessed at Kaiser Autism Center, and their specialist said my son was not autistic. There was a second opinion by Easter Seals, Bay Area Autism Services, who also said my son was not autistic. My son's special day class teacher he had for 2 years also said there's no indication my son is autistic. Before entering Evoke, my son was at a therapeutic day school for 3 years, and they did not have any concerns that my son was suspected to be autistic. However, Mr. B from Evoke, who is an outstanding therapist, by the way, suspected my son may possibly be autistic. Excuse me. Dr. O just today diagnosed my son with autism. I am totally shocked, surprised, and devastated. More importantly, I am in disbelief and confused. This does not make sense. How can this be? Great question. Take a few days. I think this question actually may have come in today. But give yourself time to adjust to it. What has changed over the years is that we see autism as a spectrum. It's the autism spectrum disorder, right? And at the very most mild end, It's barely noticeable. At the severe end of autism, it's obviously as noticeable as it's ever been. But what we've become more comfortable with diagnosing children or people with, not just comfortably emotionally, which I think is true, but also in terms of our measurements, is talking about high functioning autism, right? It's just a separation between nonverbal and learning. Excuse me, nonverbal and verbal learning, right? You can even be above average in both, but if there's a far enough split in the IQ testing, you have a nonverbal learning disability or a high functioning autism spectrum. The problem with all diagnosis and all psychological testing is it's problem focused. I remember getting my most recent child, getting her testing back, and I remember being prepared for it, but even being prepared for it, I was a little bit shocked by what it said. And my wife was even more shocked because she doesn't do this day to day. But you have to take it with a proverbial grain of salt. You know, what we're saying, what all of us are saying with our diagnosis, either objectively or subjectively, either through objective testing or through what we would call natural observation, is this is the theme. This is the way you present. Your mental health issues, and this is true of all of you and me too, they tend to organize into this pattern of behavior. And this pattern, if consistent enough, is considered a diagnosis. I talk about this in my chapter on mental health and the audacity to be you. I think that non-therapists or novice therapists or lay people tend to think of it in too much of a binary way, like you are or you aren't. You know, my kids, our family, we all know what our tendencies are. We were sitting around the dinner table a couple of weeks ago. This might not be a normal family activity, but my youngest said, let's talk about everybody's mental health diagnoses, or at least their tendency. Dad got one, mom got one, all four siblings got one. Even one of the siblings' significant others got one. And so it's just a tendency, a proclivity, an inclination, a way of describing in shorthand how somebody operates. It can change over time. You know, we'd like to say that psychological testing is perfect, but it can evolve somewhat. It can be affected by the context, by stress, by the stage of life. So hold it lightly. Ask questions like, so what does this tell me about, what does this ask of me? What is my child's proclivities, their tendencies? What does it ask of me, or what does it require of me? And if I could be so bold as to say, take it out of this kind of set in stone, this is the way that it is, there's no other way to describe it kind of sensibility, and just say, okay, at this point in time, this is how my child is presenting. What can that teach me about what my child's needs are that aren't getting met, perhaps? And can I lean into that? Diagnosis has so much stigma. I mean, frankly, I don't have the same kind of stigma because I'm in it, that I could tell you my diagnosis, my tendency, and it wouldn't have the same. When I've offered the same kind of diagnosis to somebody else, a friend or a colleague, they've acted offended or shocked or surprised. And I'm like, I have it too. You know, we all have something. We all have an Achilles heel. We all have a way of coping under stress. And diagnosis, they just tell us the style of the way of coping, the likelihood that it's going to show up in this way. I hope that helps. It can be overwhelming. You know, I wish in some ways we could be different about our diagnoses, and I wish it could be more general. Like we could arrange it into categories or numbers, like they do with the Enneagram, so it didn't have so much it didn't have so much finality to it. It didn't feel so extreme, so absolute. And I'm sorry because it's a tough day. And if you don't do this every day, you can take these. You can give those things much more weight than they need to be given. Somebody says, "Can you address the transition home, no aftercare, and how to manage or roll with regressive issues, relapse of symptoms when they arise? I know to look at my own reactions, do my work, own it, communicate my feelings, and clear on boundaries. What if the teen just ignores the boundaries? How do we get things back on track?" Whew, that's a big question. I do have at least one broadcast, Leah, on transitioning home, coming home after wilderness. So I would refer you to that. Um, based on how well your question was written, this might seem like you already know what I'm about to say, but do your work. How do you? We can't control them. We can only control us. I was talking to my daughter's significant other, who's also finishing up a PhD in clinical psychology. And he was presenting to me an outline for a class that he was working on, class that he's going to be teaching for men, a men's group. And he was talking about soul, about the soul. And I always had a hard time with that word. Like, what does it mean? Is it kind of a Judeo-Christian version of a soul? What does soul mean? And he started to talk about the layers and the depth of things, understanding meaning that is beyond words. The transformation that this work requires or asks of us is to be able to see and hear our children's struggles in a different way. To not focus on the behaviors, good or bad, but to focus on what's beneath them. What are the root causes? What are the unmet needs? And to be able to respond to the child with that in mind. So, what I would say, based on your question, is do your work, do your work, do your work, do your work. Stay on your side of the street. Focus almost primarily on your coping and relating to your son rather than on what he's doing. But look to listen and hear and regard his bad behavior in a different way than you have before. Right? Develop some depth when you see acting out or defiance or regression. Find a depth to it. Find out what it means. Find out what it's trying to tell you. So it sounds like you have a good foundation already. It's just more of that. At the end of the day, folks, if you want to know the magic bullet, the silver bullet, if you want to know the magic pixie dust, it's doing your work. I mean, your work is the portal to all of the wisdom in the universe. And we allow ourselves to get distracted and make our children or our spouse the project. And that conveniently prevents us from looking at the things inside of us that need work on. So all of this work is a shift. It's more fundamental than behavior change. It's more fundamental than cooperation or defiance. It is learning how to be a person and relate to another person. My therapist will say this very often to me. I would not have understood this 10 years ago at all. She'll say to me when I'm talking about a case, a person in my family, she'll say, they don't know what it means to be a person. They don't know how to relate to another person. And that sounds so vague and sweeping that 10 years ago wouldn't have made sense to me. Now I'm like, oh, it's just, they just don't know. They don't know how to deal with it. And what can I do to be supportive? What can I do to be helpful? You know, a long answer to your question is my book, The Audacity to Be You. I mean, that's what I'm trying to. When I was thinking about naming the book, an alternative name that I had was What It Means to Be a Person and Relate to Another and to Love Another. But that sounded less catchy. It sounded too vague. It sounded like it wouldn't reach people. It wouldn't pull people in. So The Audacity to Be You was learning to love your horrible rotten self felt a little bit more interesting than that. But yeah, learn how to relate to their problems in a different way. Next question writes, thank you for listing the podcast link for the Coming Home webinar. If the basis of addiction is connection and relationship to others, then how can addiction be called a disease when I've been told that mental health is the disease and addiction is the self-medication to feel okay? Then how is telling my son if he is using that he can't live at home? I feel like the action of putting him out fosters his disconnection from his family by where his reach for drugs becomes that much easier. I'm going to read that again. If the basis of addiction is connection and relationship to others, then how can addiction be called a disease when I have been told that mental health is the disease and addiction is the self-medication? If our kids are self-medicating to feel okay, then how is telling my son if he is using, he can't live at home? I feel like the action of putting him out fosters the disconnection from his family by where his reach for drugs becomes that much easier. I love your question. Those who are teaching and talking about the trauma and the mental health as being the basis and the addiction as being the compulsive self-medicating would argue against the disease model in many cases. Gabor Mate, probably the most famous trauma teacher today, does not like to use the disease model. He says it's just not true. Those that use the disease model would say, yeah, trauma is a part of it, but my brain is different. It's like looking at that elephant from many different places. I think both are true. And I think that the part that you're getting stuck on is the work isn't to cure your child. The work is to cure your disease, which is codependency. I mean, trauma and attachment trauma change the brain's structure. So now it looks and mirrors a disease. And there's a predisposition that all of us have to everything, more or less. My problem with Gabor Mate and that group of people is it's idiotic, frankly, to say it's all environment. That's something we solved in school 50 years ago. And it's unenlightened or uninformed to say it's only genetics and predisposition and the environment doesn't interact with that. Everybody knows it's both. So the binary is nonsense. And the binary actually is evidence of the individual's pathology, frankly. When I heard Gabor Mate speak at our conference, we had him brought in. I didn't like what he had. I mean, I like what he's doing in some ways in the world, but I thought he was ridiculous. His pathology was on full display. His narcissism was right there in front of all of us. And the addiction folks were angry. And Gabor Mate was arrogantly dismissive of them. It's both. It's all of it put together. And the wonderful thing about the disease model is there's no judgment in the disease, but there's no judgment in the trauma model either, or the mental health model. It's just looking at the same phenomenon through a different lens, and more enlightened people will say, of course, there's value in both lenses. They offer something significant. They contribute something significantly to it. And your boundaries, whether or not you're having it at home, in the Audacity to Be You, I make this very, very clear. you curing your dependency does nothing for the child to cure their disease. It doesn't fix it. The only thing that curing your dependency fixes is you. Now, that shift has ripple effects, has an impact, has an influence. But you see, I'm using words that aren't cause and effect. Cause and effect, black or white, addiction versus trauma, mental health, those are all binary, primitive coping ways of thinking. Healthy, evolved people don't think in two piles. We think in lots and lots of gray, right? We think in the middle path, as they talk about in Buddhism or in DBT. We think about both and. We don't think about either or. So if you set a boundary that I'll answer the question this way simply. I've told the story, but it's a great one, I think, to illustrate it. When I was asked, when teaching about codependency, when I was asked by a psychologist in the audience, they asked me, Brad, how can you tell us to tell a mother to kick her son out of the home when the possibility is that he could die, which is basically the same question you just asked me. And I said, I would never tell a mother to kick her opiate-addicted son out of the house. My job would be to help that mother treat and deal with and cope and recover from her codependency, and she would decide what to do. In the wonderful TED Talk by Johann Hari on, I think the title is Everything You Think You Know About Addiction Is Wrong, where it teaches and preaches what you're describing, you learn that addiction, the best response to addiction is compassion and non-judgment and love. But here's the rub, folks. Here's the big rub. The problem is, for us codependents, when we hear that the solution for addiction is love and non-judgment and patience and second and third and fourth chances, we lose a sense of ourselves. We think it not okay to set a boundary. We think it not okay to prioritize our well-being over our child's. We think our value is what we do for the child or the spouse or the friend, and that to take care of ourselves first and foremost is selfish, because that's our disease. So when I show the video by Johann Hari on everything you need to know, everything you thought you knew about addiction is wrong. If you haven't seen it yet, go watch it tonight. It's a 14-minute TED Talk. Johann Hari. It's wonderful. I always ask the questions. What are the personal implications for you? I was just working with a family recently that had a young adult son walk out of the program. And what I said to them is, practice love, but own your limits. Own what you're willing and not willing to do. And no matter what anybody tells you, don't be sold this bill of goods that if you set the boundaries correctly, if you do all the right things, you can fix your son's addiction. That's crazy. And yet therapists imply that all the time. You end up in programs like Evoke or other programs, and the implication is you just haven't been setting good boundaries. You've been enabling. You've been rescuing. You're the cause of the addiction. Well, guess what? When you get into recovery for codependency, one of the first things you learn is you're not the cause of the addiction. Yes, you're dancing with it now because of your disease, but they practice the 3 C's, which is you didn't cause it, you can't cure it, and you can't control it. So if I suggest to you that by doing what you're suggesting, maybe has been suggested to you before, which is kicking your kid out of the house, the point is you can't control it. So stop making decisions with the reference point that if you do it right, it'll be fixed, and make the decision for you. But we don't even know how to think about that because we're codependent. Do you see? That doesn't even make sense to us. That seems like psychobabble nonsense. I'm a little excited about this because it's prolific. in this field. And it's shameful that it gets taught to parents. You know, we take your own codependency and we weaponize it against you by telling you it's your fault that it turned out this way. And if you do it right going forward, I guarantee that it'll fix it. And that is BS. That is abuse, plain and simple. So work on your codependency, heal it. And whatever decision you make, if it's made from a healthy place, I support it. If it's made from a place of fear or control, I'll challenge it. I'll challenge your thinking, not the decision. But it's made from a place of love and surrender. You see, it's hard to get it wrong. That's why Star Wars is such a good metaphor, because it's a metaphor. That's why it's so valuable. Because what Lucas was trying to teach was there are two primary forces in the universe. And one of those forces that he called the dark side is fear, anger, control, and hatred, right? On the other side of the rainbow, if you will, is love, surrender, authenticity, and feeling everything. If you do it from a place of fear or anger or control, it's impossible to get it right. And if you do it from a place of love, from capable love, it's nearly impossible to get it wrong. So you happen to step into one of my little soapboxes. So that's my answer to that. Somebody writes, our son was at Evoke for 3 months. He's 15. He's now at a therapeutic boarding school. We just got a letter from him about not being pleased with a lot. We can ask his therapist about specifics, but since we are not there, we really don't know what's going on. We have visited and vetted the school, but we feel very helpless on really knowing the truth. We never felt this one shade of concern at Evoke. I mean, you sound like you're doing the right thing. You know, I'm almost aging myself out of this work. When I started this work, being a wilderness therapist 25 years ago, that's about how old most of the therapists are these days, right? Late 20s and 30s, most of them. So I've stuck on a while. I'm proud of that. But you have to find a capable therapist who can help you through that. You have to find somebody who can alleviate your concerns and that can, when I get a complaint from a person about Evoke, I do my own research. I find out where we may have dropped the ball or missed the mark. And I confront that head on. I apologize to the client. And where I might think it's a relationship dynamic between the child and the parent, I skillfully teach how that's in play. So there's no magical cure other than that. You have to be able to have a dialogue with your son's therapist. You have to trust that therapist. They have to give you intelligent answers. They have to make sure that what is being complained about is absolutely investigated and dealt with in whatever way it needs to be. And then you have to have a conceptualization about what's going on in the back and forth between your son that you can trust, make sense out of, and can use going forward. So be a squeaky wheel. Ask tough questions. Sometimes I want to move into the next phase of my career and just provide clinical training for therapeutic programs all over the country, adolescent and young adult programs all over the country, because the therapists are relatively young. I mean, I spend so much of my time doing it at Evoke, like training people, saying, look, I'm going to show you this to you physically, actually, because this is the one that I shared with our team. It says, you're allowed to tell your therapist, no, that's not it. And I asked all of our therapists who have an Evoke related Instagram account to share that, because I said, I want you to be giving permission to your families to tell you when they're upset or questioning what you're doing, or don't like it or don't agree with it. And I want you to be capable enough to know how to deal with that. So I'm with you. Tell them to read my books. Tell them to read my article on psychology versus therapy that I published in the NatSap Journal a few years ago. Ask tough questions and keep asking. And if they seem bored or frustrated or exhausted by you being the squeaky wheel, tell them that's BS and that you're paying for this. And if there's some healing that you need to do, that you need to work on that. But you need compassion and understanding, just like any client in the world needs. So that's my 10 cents. Somebody writes, we're learning to let go of outcomes. We're wondering how to do that when our 15-year-old child is in treatment and not engaging in the process. She's been in a number of mental health inpatient programs and is always discharged early because there's no progress. She is plowing through our savings quickly. She asks about our finances. We don't indulge those conversations. And it feels like she is testing us to see how far we will go to support her. She is not safe to come home, and we are wondering how long we can afford to keep her in treatment. Letting go of outcomes feels like either accepting financial ruin or letting an unstable minor out on the streets. Any thoughts? You know, imagine if you had no money for this program or these programs. That's why I encourage you all to go to Al-Anon and Codependence Anonymous. And for those of you who haven't tried it yet, try ACA, Adult Children of Alcoholics. It might not seem like it fits you because of the title, but you'll be surprised how many dynamics are consistent between alcoholic and non-alcoholic families. So, I wouldn't encourage financial ruin, but it's your call. If you have to do what you have to do to feel good about, but I don't think one has to ruin their retirement. I don't think you have to. If you want to, I'm supportive of that, but you don't have to. It is a spiritual ask to ask somebody to consider to let go of that which is outside of their control. And the only way I know how to answer this question, in a moment or two on a question and answer webinar is go to Al-Anon and listen to people who have had to deal with it, who didn't have money to send their child to any program like this, and ask them how they deal with it. There has to be a psychological, emotional, and spiritual answer to this question. There has to be. Because if there's not, then anybody who can't afford these programs is absolutely doomed. And that's just not true. Maybe you'll end up talking to somebody at a meeting who lost the child to addiction or suicide. And you can say, how do you do it? How did you do it? Tell me your story so I understand what it's like to be up against the defense, up against the immovable object. I mean, I think there's more in your story. I do think there's more in your story, but my short answer is go to Al-Anon because there are people there who never had any money to send their child, in some cases even to outpatient therapy, and listen to their stories and how they made sense out of it and how they learned to cope. And also find a community where you're not alone. But letting go doesn't mean not having a boundary or having a boundary. That's the soul answer. The soul answer, letting go, is it's deeper. It means showing up in your life as authentically as you can and understanding the separation between you and other, between you and child, between you and spouse, between you and friend, between you and job, right? It's knowing where you stop and others start. It's staying on your side of the street. It's not passive. It's absolutely assertive. It's not caring. It's really what the only true version of love is. So it's a spiritual question and a spiritual answer. And those are the places I would direct you to find out what that spiritual answer sounds like. All right, I got enough time for one more. Can we get a little bit more detail as to what an intensive is all about? Well, it's really about two things. It's about looking at your family of origin through psychodrama or role play and understanding what that family of origin or early context taught you about relationships and people and you, and understanding how all of those lessons are showing up in your present day relationships, situations, dilemmas, and crises, and kind of understanding what the project is. One of the quotes that I shared last week is from Connie Zweig. She's a writer of one of my favorite books called Me in the Shadow, co-author of it. And she said in one of her books, like, I began to consider, after many years of therapy and visiting gurus in India and on, she said, I began to consider that the way I led my life was the reason for my unhappiness. See, most of us think that it's our struggling children, and if we can fix that, we'll be happy. Or it's our jerk spouse, or it's our boss, or our job, or whatever it is, right? We're looking to solve something outside of us. Evoke's idea, Buddhism's idea, DBT's idea, Al-Anon's idea, right? In my opinion, good therapy's idea helps you to realize that the dilemma's inside. So we find out your story and we find out how it's playing itself out. So then going forward, we don't cure you in 4.5 days, but you have peace and clarity and confidence and hope, most of all, because you see and feel what the project is. And I guarantee you the project is not in fixing somebody else. The project is in addressing and coping and dealing with what is yours. And that's a lifelong pursuit. I tell our intensive staff all the time, if we're successful, that will result in varying levels of insight for varying clients based on where they're coming from, what's available to them, and so forth. But at the end, we'll give them a taste of something sweet. We'll give them an experience in a compassionate setting, in a loving and connected setting, perhaps for the first time in their life, so that going forward, they know what to work on. And they want to find a therapist or therapeutic tools to help them to work on that project. Psychodrama, role plays, family of origin, and then on to current day dilemmas. That's what it's all about. All right, folks, my 2 books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, which we've talked about tonight, and The Audacity to Be You, are available on Amazon and Audible. I did The Audacity to Be You in my own voice. If you are a current or alumni family member of our wilderness program, we have support groups for you online each week. The next one is July 15th, this Thursday at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. For our intensives alumni, the next one is July 13th. That's tomorrow night at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Email Malia at Evoke Therapy for more information. If you want to do an intensive, a deep dive into your own work, we have in-person options available. Contact intensives at Evoke Therapy. We also have online options available. And you go to our website for more information. If you've been to a Finding You, we have Returning to You. I'll be running that in October 6th through 10th. So the dates are there. We also have professional workshops for professionals who are interested. So we have one coming up in December for professionals. If you want an Evoke trained therapist / coach to work with, you can contact Travis at evoketherapy.com. We have pursuit trips for families and young adults. Think therapy light, adventure trips all over the world, custom made for families or young adults. Think therapy light or reconnecting or recalibrating your therapeutic project in combination with wonderful activities. We ask all current family members of Evoke clients to go to 6 of any combination of these 12-step support groups: alanon.org, coda.org, familiesanonymous.org, adultchildren.org. refugerecovery.org is a variation, a support group that's Buddhist inspired, not based on the 12 steps or a higher power. And then the National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI.org, is also a great place to get free classes and resources in your area. You can find all of these broadcasts on your favorite podcast platform. Just search Finding You at Evoke Therapy Podcast or on SoundCloud.com. On Twitter and Instagram, you can find us using the handle @Evoke Therapy or @Evoke Therapy Intensives. And you can find mine @Dr. Brad Reedy on Twitter and Instagram. And then @Evoke Therapy Intensives also, excuse me, @Evoke Therapy Intensive, excuse me, @Evoke Therapy also has a Twitter account, and so do I. You can find us on Facebook by searching Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. And then our blog has new content each week that Malia is the curator of, and she does a wonderful job. My next broadcast will be in 2 nights. On Wednesday, July 14th at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time, I'll be talking about phone calls and field visits. It's actually a twist because there's new legislation in a lot of states coming out that's affecting phone calls and visits. So if you're in the process, you'll want to hear this. Thank you for joining me this evening. I hope this was a helpful point of contact. It's great to see all of you here. Thank you for and on behalf of your loved ones for you being willing to do your own work. Take care, and I'll talk to you on Wednesday. Bye-bye.